So I
Oh,
was.
yeah.
All right, everyone, welcome. This is the final session of a really jam-packed and amazing weekend. I mean, we've had a great session here, and it's so exciting to be. It's exciting in one sense to be going at the same time that all these other 80 some odd tracks are running, and it's also a little disappointing because I wish I could hear what's going on there. But as John Cobb said, we're going to carry this work forward and publish it in one form or another as we leave here. So this isn't the end. But we have a special treat now. Two of the most important teachers in my life, and I'm sure that's true for many of you who are here. I'm going to introduce them both now, although Rick Tarnas is going to speak first, and then Brian will follow up. Rick Tarnas is the author, of course, of The Passion of the Western Mind. He's also the author of Cosmic Psyche, Intimations of the New World View. He's the founder of quite a unique graduate program at the California Institute of Mythical Studies called the Philosophy of Cosmology and Consciousness Program, which many of you already know about, but maybe a few of you haven't heard of it yet. And then over here we have Brian Swim. Brian is, he's been a teacher and professor at CIS for 25 years now. He's the author, co-author of a few really important books. The Universe Story, we co-authored with Thomas Berry, and more recently, The Journey of the Universe, co-authored with Marietta Tucker. It's also a DVD documentary that I hope everyone can see. I think it played on Friday or Thursday. Rick is among perhaps one of the deepest depth psychologists you'll ever encounter. Brian is one of the most far-out cosmologists.
You want to go far and deep, there they are.
That's nice.
We're the deepest cosmologist and the farthest out psychologist.
So whether it's Rick who's going to expand our minds or deepen our minds, or Brian who's going to do one or the other, they're going to meet in the middle somewhere. We're going to go as far out as we can and arrive back in this world again and see it as TSL inside again for the first time. So, yeah, as Brian said earlier, buckle your seatbelts and enjoy the ride.
Matt, you said this was the last session, are we not having a session
There's one more talk, which is Becca Tarnas, which will be at 4 o'clock.
Right,
But
so
this
that's
is,
two.
you're right.
2 sessions. Thank you, Matt. Thanks for the unbelievable amount of work that you've done for setting up this track, all these sessions, and also what you do at what you and Becca do as well in our Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program. They're real pillars of it. I'm just going to go lickety split here because of our limited time. I'll do the first part. Brian does the second. Then we'll have our dialogue. And there actually is going to be a third PCC faculty member just making a brief appearance. Much more famous and performatively gifted than we are. You'll be seeing him in a couple of minutes with this here on screen. Yeah, we got another seat there. So, radical mythal speculation. I'll just talk about the part of the subtitle that's mine, or to which I am particularly participating in deep history and a second axial age. I think many of you have all those terms already at hand, but I will briefly define each of those when they're relevant. I basically in this talk would like to explore the idea that the postmodern, whether we call it the postmodern era or the postmodern sensibility, that it is an transformation. In particular, for that dominant and dominating form of our species embodied in modern civilization and the modern self. Let me first look for a moment at the premise of our track that we were assigned for this conference, for our contribution to the conference, namely that in late modernity, a kind of scientific, reductive, materialistic monism has become dominant. To quote the premise, the early modern dualism between a free mind and a deterministic nature has largely given way more recently to a form of scientific materialist monism that undermines the political ideals of democracy. Whereas despite all other deleterious effects, at least the mind-matter dualism allowed early modern people to take seriously the idea that human beings are responsible agents capable of acting more or less freely as members of moral and or legal communities. In today's more materialistic and scientific context, when the human, when the human person has largely been reduced to brain activity, democratic self-governance begins to seem like an outdated fantasy. What that is pointing to, I believe, could be, basically, if you think of this here as being the primal participation, this would be with an embedded self in a world that is imbued with meaning, purpose, spirit, intelligence, consciousness, pervading it, in which the human being is participating at a very kind of local, embodied level in community, and relatively undifferentiated from the whole. And by contrast, the modern self, the modern Cartesian self, has in some sense appropriated all the consciousness and purposeful intelligence in the cosmos, as it were, and located it inside the human self. That, from the point of view of the Cartesian self, it is what is carrying purpose, meaning, conscious intelligence, etc. And that's the dualism that John Cott's talking about, vis-a-vis a voided cosmos that's all the meaning and purpose has been erased. It's been voided. You see the world as it is. If you see it as neutral facts, as lacking in any intrinsic teleological dimension, if you think you're seeing something like that, you're projecting human meaning onto the non-human world, etc. That's basically the kind of the modern dualism. And really what the premise of this track, at least one way of describing it, is that, let's see what kind of, thanks, Sean. If we were to have this movement to the late modern illustrated, we would say that the void of the cosmos, the meaningless, mechanistic, materialistic universe, has in some sense swallowed the subject, and it's kind of imploding, as it were. This void is imploding till we become just a genetic strategy, a mean machine, a result of neuronal activity in the brain that is basically creating the Cartesian theater of the modern self. So there's been this implosion. Okay, so that's the basic starting point. And I just want to offer as a beginning point that I think this characterization of our current zeitgeist underestimates and simplifies it a little too much. I agree that materialistic monism is indeed an element of the current moment, but I don't view it as being as dominant as that characterization would hold. It underestimates the presence of a tremendous plurality of religious and metaphysical perspectives that are shaping the cultural climate. Even in Western intellectuals and the secular cultural elite, and their reliance on moral sources that are often unconsciously rooted in Judaism, Christianity, Platonic sources, Enlightenment humanism, and Romanticism. There's a tremendous sense of interiority, of agency, of the sacredness of the human person, human individual, etc. So I'm just wanting to complexify that initial characterization, and that we are navigating the world, drawing on a multiplicity of perspectives. I think that this characterization even underestimates what the materialist reductionist in his or her heart actually believes and relies on. And to illustrate this point with a signal example of what I am going to refer as the postmodern sensibility at work or at play from our PCC faculty colleague John Cleese, who during the years that he lived in California and having many conversations with us, including also giving a course, as many of you know, at CIS with me, he went out in his backyard in Santa Barbara and recorded this neat little 3-minute skit that I think demonstrates many of the points that I want us to have in the background. He says it very economically as we go forward.
We scientists have now located a gene which we scientists believe gives people the needs to believe in God. In other words, this God gene releases chemicals into our body which create the impression that there is meaning in the universe. And this God gene is just here, between the gene which we scientists now know makes us eat coconut ice cream after a fish dinner, and this gene here, which causes people with weak egos to grasp around desperately for simple explanations. Now, the discovery of this God gene is a big step forward in our quest to show that every bit of human behavior can be explained away mechanically, because we've now also located the gene which makes some people believe that every piece of human behavior can be explained away mechanically. It's here, right next to the gene that makes you go to see Nicolas Cage movies, so that's another puzzle solved. And under this gene, which can cause you to forget that since the 1920s, quantum physics has destroyed forever the idea that everything can be explained mechanically. Now, the gene which causes us to forget this obvious fact is very dominant in some people, especially me. And we scientists now know that it's closely linked to this gene here, which gives you such a weak sense of self that you hang on to anything that makes you feel more secure emotionally, whether it's fundamentalist religion or a reductionist view of the universe, which is right over this gene here that makes you want to punch people in the head when they take the scientific process and subject it to their pathological literal mindedness. Thank you. I leave. And by the way, we now know that there is a gene that causes you to say, thank you, I needed that, just there, when you were punched in the head.
So I think this says it all. Everyone gets it. Even the materialist reductionist gets it when he or she sees this. They can, for a moment, see through that tendency within themselves. Materialistic monism, it's a big factor, but it's not all dominating. It's not even really held in the sense of coherently performed or enacted by its most zealous defenders. who rely on psychological and spiritual resources to live by, even when they theorize about the nature of the human being and the nature of the universe in what they believe, secretly believe, is a brilliantly heroic act of human superiority, with all the meaning that's attached to the hero archetype and being brilliantly transcending the rest of the world, etc., and the rest of the less intelligent human population, over the unheroic world of meaningless matter and energy. I think only a certain kind of a lack of self-lucidity allows them to really press their position with the absoluteness that is sometimes done. So what I think John's done here is he's kind of combined Thomas Kuhn and Sigmund Freud at a pretty advanced and creative level in this act of psychological and philosophical reflexivity, dethroning that widespread unconscious assumption of a God's eye view. We scientists now know, as he's dressed in his white coat and everything, we scientists now know. It's like a mantra, and that's the God's eye view that is being unconsciously introjected, seeing things objectively, while the rest of the possible positions are subjective and therefore not as reliable as theirs. And by following in the skit, by following its claims to a kind of totalizing explanatory reductionism, the skit climaxes in what logically must happen from such a premise, namely a self-implosion, knocking the God's eye view right out of the picture. This elegantly captures certain dimensions of the postmodern mood, including not only its deconstruction of fundamentalisms, both scientific and religious, but also, as you will have noticed, a certain opening to a universe of potential meaning as a kind of co-creative live option, which I would view now as an equally essential characteristic of the postmodern, where there is so much more awareness of our interpretive role in creating, in a recursive way, through our perspectives, our paradigms, our worldviews, our myths, we recursively elicit and navigate, negotiate with many other centers of being and discernment and will to co-create a much more complex reality, and we have a role in it. And so while there is an enormous element of indeterminacy, quantum physics, the sense of uncertainty, of not knowing, that's so fundamental to the postmodern moment. And at the same time, there's these intimations of re-enchantment. They're there as part of the recursive potentiality. The disenchanted worldview is a live option. The enchanted worldview is a live option. This gets to Robert Bella's famous passage that I used as an epigraph towards the end of Passion of the Western Mind, where he just said, any true reintegration of our culture of a unity of consciousness will not be on the basis of any new orthodoxy, either scientific or religious. It will be based on the rejection of all univocal understandings of reality, all identifications of one conception of reality with reality itself. It will recognize the necessity to translate constantly between different scientific and imaginative vocabularies, one of the imaginative vocabularies being the scientific vocabulary, and avoid that proclivity that we human beings have to fall comfortably into some single literal interpretation. And I think what we're attempting to do here, Brian and I, it will bear that aspiration towards that constant translation between different symbolic frames of reference, different vocabularies, scientific and imaginative. And as Bella goes on to say, all we have finally are symbols, which is a very postmodern statement. All we have finally are symbols, but there's an enormous difference between the dead letter and the living word. Because the dead letter is a symbol that just is inside the potted plant, and it's just our social linguistic construct of reality that we're seeing, versus the idea that our symbol systems may also be that we as human beings and our consciousness, our psyche, our bodies are rooted in the earth, rooted in the cosmos, and are expressive. Our worldviews and their unfolding are expressive of the cosmic process. And therefore, that's where the symbol, as Jung says, I entirely agree with Karenyi when he says that in the symbol, the world itself is speaking, rather than the symbol being locked into a kind of private subjectivity, that the symbol can be a living word. Okay, so 3 versions of our moment in history. There's many of you in this room have heard me quote from these before, so I'll just headline them. There's Jung's description of our moment in history as a kairos, this mood of universal destruction and renewal that set its mark on our age, makes itself felt everywhere, politically, socially, philosophically, ecologically, we could obviously add. We're living in what the Greeks called the kairos, the right moment for a metamorphosis of the gods, of the fundamental principles and symbols. It's not of our conscious choosing, it's the expression of the unconscious within us, unconscious human within us who is changing. So much is at stake, and so much depends on the psychological constitution of the modern human. So that's Jung. Then there's Woody Allen. His speech to the graduates. Instead of the kairos moment, he's talking about the crossroads of history. More than at any other time in history, mankind faces a crossroads. One path leads to despair and utter hopelessness. The other path to total extinction. Let us pray we have the wisdom to choose correctly. I speak, by the way, not with any sense of futility, but with a panicky conviction of the absolute meaninglessness of existence, which could easily be misinterpreted as pessimism. It is not. It is merely a healthy concern for the predicament of modern man. Those of you who were reading things in the 50s and 60s will remember that the predicament of modern man, like that was like the existentialist reality. Modern man is here defined as any person born after Nietzsche's edict that God is dead, but before the recording, I want to hold your hand. And then for my final quick rendering of our moment in history as a kind of characterization from our own Brian Swim. The challenge of conscious self-awareness is unlike anything that has occurred for millions of years. We are finding ourselves in the midst of a vast transition. How are we to respond? For we sense we are in a dark night. We dwell in unknowing, and yet grope forward. This dark, unknowing state of the postmodern. The path is uncertain. The path is still unclear. With what shall we navigate? The path is uncertain because our sense of larger purpose and destiny is clouded. We are seeking patterns that connect us to a vaster destiny, a vital participation in Earth's unfolding. There's nothing more mysterious than destiny of a person, of our species, of our planet, of the universe itself. And as you can see, with that sentence, Brian moves entirely outside of the usual vocabulary of scientific objectivity. As soon as you start talking about destiny, you're doing something else. And what we're doing is mythospeculation, radical mythospeculation. And here's the definition of this. It's a term that the sociologist Robert Bellah used, that is radical mythospeculation. He drew from the term mythospeculation from Eric Voegelin, the historian and philosopher, which he employed to describe, well, Bellah described this. He used this idea, the radical mythospeculation, to describe an important phenomenon in the history of human cultures, when the evolution of symbolic consciousness in certain complex societies, ancient Greece, Israel, China, India, reached a degree of critical reflexivity that transcended the undifferentiated social religious cosmologies of the archaic civilization, but it did not reject the mythic narrative mode of cognition. It was holding both. This creative synthesis of logos and mythos, of the rational theoretic and the mythic narrative, of rigor and imagination, was crucial to the emergence of what Karl Jaspers called the Axial Age of the first millennium BCE, when humankind went through this spectacularly rapid transformation of its consciousness and its symbol systems that gave birth to many of the most prominent religious, philosophical, and scientific traditions that continue to shape our world today. It may be that a comparable synthesis of mythos and logos is struggling to emerge again today in our time, and will be crucial for that movement beyond this no man's zone that we are in, that Thomas Perry talks about, that sense that we're in between stories. I want to posit the idea that this in-between state, which is in some ways the definition of the postmodern in every way, epistemologically, relationally, the in-between, ontologically, that in-between state that the postmodern represents is in some sense is a part of, it is a story itself. It is something that has its own meaning. It's not just it is the transitional epoch, I think, par excellence, but it is not something simply to be gotten out of. It's something to be totally drunk in, absorbed, assimilated, explored, integrated psychosomatically, imaginatively, spiritually, everything that goes with the postmodern, the drinking of the confrontation with the moral shadow that is so much part of it, the grieving, the recognition of the fall that has taken place in many respects, the fall from primal unity, greater sense of unity between human nature and the spiritual dimension of life, the fall from that axial sense of light and certain truth that was above this world of that lacked that was the tremendously differentiated axial dualisms, which we'll get into. And also the postmodern is a fall from the modern, that old confidence in the faith in modern progress, the myth of progress, which we see all around us, the consequence of both that faith and the loss of faith that all who take in the unintended consequences of the modern juggernaut can recognize. We wouldn't be here now having these discussions, using the vocabularies and forms of reflections that we are, without that axial age, really between about 600 and 300 BCE, it pretty much all happened. But it's equally true that we wouldn't be here having to deal with the global ecological crisis if it hadn't been for the axial age. That age both constellated and affirmed a powerful set of hierarchical dualisms, spirit and matter, transcendent and immanent, eternity and time. One, so eternity and time, one and many, spirit and matter, transcendent and immanent, reality and illusion, mind and body, truth and opinion, universal and particular, also the human and nature. That differentiation begins to receive tremendous power at that point. And it gave us irreplaceable moral and intellectual resources for dealing with the crisis that these dualisms have produced. That's the great paradox of the axial era. It gave us, it both set in motion the crisis that we now see, differentiations turning into dissociations, and so forth, the modern playing the crucial role in this transition, and the moral and intellectual resources for confronting it. I love that passage from Octavio Paz, the Mexican poet. The examination of conscience and the remorse that accompanies it, which is a legacy of the axial era, has been and will continue to be the sole most powerful remedy for the ills that face our civilization. There's so much to that, facing of the shadow. Jung said, the master said the apprentice piece of psychological development is the encounter with the shadow. The masterpiece, he said, is the integration of the anima, which is the whole, speaking collectively, the anima mundi, the dissolving of the old sense of differentiated, dissociated human subjectivity in a world of meaningless objects. I won't spend more time describing or unpacking the axial age, since most of you will be deeply familiar with the idea and the historical phenomena behind it. I just want to point out one major fact of its historical emergence, and that's the fact that it was particularly focused on not moving out of the primal. Big changes had already happened then, through chiefdoms, and then the great archaic civilizations like Egypt and Mesopotamia, and the civilizations in the New World. And in that case, what you had here was that pyramid of spiritual authority where the pharaoh and king were identified with God. And then there's all the hierarchy below it. And that close association between the king or the pharaoh and the divine principle, sometimes identified as it, sometimes the son of it, etc., was broken through with the Axial Period, when the prophet in Israel and the philosopher in Greece and the sage in China and the mystic in India, basically, to put it in a single exemplary sentence, just said, look, yeah, you're really powerful, king. What you're saying is good, but there is a power that is much greater than yours, coming from a king of kings, and that's where the good exists, the good with a capital G, the Platonic archetypal good that exists in a transcendent sphere. And from that position, I can critique your good as not being maybe just, maybe not really being good. And that leverage that the axial gives people, societies and human beings goes right up through Martin Luther King saying, the just thing to do here is to overturn this unjust system, and I have the confidence, the faith that I am on the side of a higher. I have an access to a divine, to a divine principle that can see me through the power that you're putting against me to suppress this movement, and that faith moves mountains. And I want to emphasize that tremendous nobility that comes from that. That's particularly the Judaic and Christian lineage, which brings in a very propulsive historical movement to the divine entering into history and affecting this world. But there's the shadow side of it is Billy Graham saying, who, by the way, introduced Martin Luther King in the 1950s to the huge New York revival, and said this great social prophet. So I don't want to just say Billy Graham's the problem. Billy Graham, but he also said, and this is very characteristic, where he's consoling the people in the Carolinas after a hurricane happened, and he said, if we don't have faith in God the Father, we're at the mercy of Mother Nature. And right there you see in that axial, there's a masculine-feminine genderizing of the ontological, transcendent spiritual security versus the dangers of this world, Mother Nature, etc., which has huge consequences for patriarchy and moral valuation and so forth. And then, by the time, in a way, you've got a modern version of it, which is if you don't have faith in Father Science, you're at the mercy of Mother Nature and the Mother Church. Watch out. It's still in the background. And Gregory Bateson particularly pulls out the ecological consequences of this special sense that the human being has of being made in the image of God. Put God outside and set him vis-a-vis his creation. And if you have the idea that you're created in his image, you will logically and naturally see yourself as outside and against the things around you. And as you arrogate all mind to yourself, we might even say like appropriate all soul to yourself, you will see the world around you as mindless and soulless, and therefore as not entitled to moral or ethical consideration. The environment will be yours to exploit. If this is your estimate of your relation to nature, and you have an advanced technology, your likelihood of survival will be that of a snowball in hell. You will die either of the toxic byproducts of your own hate, or of maddening repetition of industrial noise, or simply of overpopulation and overgrazing. Here's the snowball in hell, right here, going through the. Okay, so with Gregory, we can begin to draw in the larger evolution of Homo sapiens and its primate, mammalian, and phylogenetic history. If we were to summarize it in just very brief ways, you could say that there's just been this gradual differentiation and elevation and empowerment of a nexus of mind and will, of discernment and volition, starting in the eukaryotes and the very early animal organisms and the nerve tissues that go in, and the muscle tissues that go into the brain and the capacity for sensing and cognition and locomotion, and that this gets more and more differentiated and complexified and magnified and elevated and centralized and substantialized as it goes through, for example, vertebrate, and then tetrapod, and then mammalian, and then the primates, these just unbelievable, agile, clever, socially complex and restless and bigger brains and so forth, until you get to Homo sapiens, and it's just this huge differentiation of a powerful self, in a sense, a nexus of agency and intelligence that is separating itself and differentiating from the whole. And in a certain way, you could say the Cartesian Newtonian mindset is the apotheosis of the vertebrate brain. And I mean apotheosis in two senses. It's both the apotheosis in that, wow, it's just like it's nailed the external world, the material world. It's just like, in the sense of now instrumental reason can really manipulate things with tremendous efficacy. And the Industrial Revolution can take off, etc. It gives tremendous confidence to the human mind. But interwoven with that was also an apotheosis in a quite literal religious symbolic sense, literal symbolic and that is that if you read carefully Copernicus, Kepler's words, Newton's, Descartes, they were all in some sense experiencing this as a religious revelation, a download of the solar logos into the modern mind that is now seeing the universe for what it is for the first time, and kind of breaking out of the fall and being able to really, in a sense, have a kind of divine light, the Enlightenment. It all comes from that moment. Michelangelo's God touching Adam on the Sistine Chapel is happening at the same moment as Copernicus is breaking through into the heliocentric revolution, and that modernity is taking off. And so the Copernican Revolution not only is an event in religious history in the sense that it has an impact on religiosity and religious symbol systems, it is itself a religious event. It had numinosity around it. Alexander Pope summarizes the Enlightenment. He says, nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, "Let Newton be," and all was light. It's like a new Genesis, a new Bible is being written. And as Matt was saying the other day, the biblical imagery that's often used by the contemporary scientists is very striking. But what began as an identification with the divine solar logos gradually turned into an identification as the divine solar logos. God died. The power of the critical mind just saw through all the divine projections. You've got Feuerbach, you've got Marx, you've got Nietzsche, you've got Darwin, you've got Sartre, and so forth. And there's just this Laplace, the unnecessary hypothesis. But in the meantime, the radiant brilliance is all there in the Cartesian "I think, therefore I am." We became the summum bonum in the universe, the highest form of known conscious intelligence and purpose in the universe. And therein lies the tragic hubris that sets in motion the postmodern. So I'm going to, I've got 5 minutes to do my finishing here. Hence the need for the deflation, the downgoing, the great descent. The true solar hero has to go down, descend into the night sky, the lunar ground, the alchemical crucible of the unconscious depths, into the great unraveling, which only thus can become the great turning. The basic thesis that I want to share with you is that many of the most distinctive and one of the most distinctive and important features of our postmodern situation bears an uncanny resemblance to initiatory rites of passage, to certain stages of what Jung called the individuation process, the great descent in Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey, the dark night of the soul in Mythical transformations, near-death experiences, what Groff has called spiritual emergencies, and the perinatal death-rebirth threshold. These qualities I'm talking about of the postmodern, that sense of deep uncertainty about the future, combined with that perception of encroaching danger, confrontation with mortality, with finitude, with unintended consequences, and therefore a sense of our great unknowingness, our ignorance, a profound crisis of meaning, a deconstruction of and a collapse and a dying of our old identity, our very sense of who we are. These are classic initiatory experiences, and the entire postmodern milieu is helping to constellate precisely those experiences, that phenomenology intense sense of isolation, alienation, an encounter with one's failings, moral shadow, the sense of groping in the darkness. Except, compared with the initiatory rites of passage, instead of being separated from the tribe or the mothers and being isolated and put through this intense process, we have been isolated from the entire community of being itself. The whole cosmos has been, in some sense, that sense of being the lonely gypsy in the meaningless world that is so characteristic of many scientific and existentialist musings. And yeah, it's a state of like free falling. That song by Tom Petty, Free Falling. It's like cat. It's like free and falling at the same time. It's like once upon a time you dressed so fine, you threw the primitives a dime, but now you don't talk so loud. Now you don't seem so proud about having to scrounge around for your next century of existence. How does it feel to be on your own, to be without a direction home, like a complete unknown, like a rolling stone? And the crucial thing here that I think we can add to what our understanding of the possibility of a second axial era, I just have to say what your cousin's understanding of the second axial era was, and then just add to it, and then give it over to Brian. And I think I put out all the things that I was supposed to. Your cousins, in conversation with Thomas Berry, developed the idea of a second axial era. I think, from what I can gather, from Thomas particularly came the sense of the need for reconnecting to like the Earth and the ecological embeddedness that needed to be reattained after the axial transcendence of the first era, axial era. While your cousins, his colleague at Fordham, emphasized, in addition to that, the coming together of all the differentiated axial religious and philosophical traditions with their special geniuses, now coming together in interreligious dialogue, ecumenical, but deep dialogical and integration of each other's wisdoms and so forth. So Cousins says the consciousness of the 21st century will be global from two perspectives. From a horizontal perspective, with cultures and religions meeting each other on the surface of the globe, entering into creative encounters that will produce a complexified collective consciousness. And secondly, from a vertical perspective, they must plunge their roots deep into the earth in order to provide a stable and secure base for future development. This new global consciousness must be organically ecological, supported by structures that will ensure justice and peace. We will not have this is not just to enhance the 21st century, it's an absolute necessity if we are to survive. To this, I would add that the vertical opening must not only be deep downwards into the earth, Gaia, our local place, Ubayadi and so forth, but also deep inwards into the psyche, as in shamanic and entheogenic, depth psychological, initiatory transformational experience and so forth. It also needs to be deep outwards into the cosmos to provide an encompassing cosmic context for humanity's spiritual aspirations and self-knowledge. And even more significantly, directly tied to that, deep inwards and outwards at the same time into the soul of the cosmos, which is it. Our soul is our entrance into one of the via regia into the soul of the cosmos itself and its profound unfolding meanings and purposes. The cosmos' interior dimension. And if we recall what happened with the first axial era, that it broke out of the old cosmology that held in place the the power, the political structure as being divinized, and it broke out of that pyramid and revealed, disclosed this transcendent dimension that was beyond any political power, and from which that could be critiqued. What I want to argue is that there's been a invisible pyramid in the modern self, with the modern inside, the modern rational self has been at the top of a pyramid with its own sense of special enlightenment divinity, with then, like primates, mammals, other, lower animals, invertebrates, and so forth, plants, element, inanimate nature, etc. And that needs to collapse. That the second axial era will, in some sense, replicate the first axial era's dissolving of the old pyramid or hierarchy, and will democratize the spiritual dignity of all beings. Okay, that's all I'm going to say.
That was great, Rick. That's fantastic. Just to pick up immediately on some of Rick's ideas. First of all, the idea of the second axial